Hi, everyone. I'm Cornell, and I'm talking today about keeping Saturn in orbit. Now, firstly, I'm not talking about the planet for those interested in gravitational pull. I'm also not talking about putting a car up there. That's another South African that you might know about. Uh, yeah, and that's me. Originally from Cape Town, South Africa. Moved over to Seattle about 7 years ago. Spent a lot of time working for AWS, both in Cape Town and Seattle. Stuff like EC2, a bit of AWS support, ECS, EKS, container-related stuff. And about a year and a bit ago, I decided to, try something very different, and I found Saturn, or Saturn found me. And I joined the team and been working there doing interesting stuff on the infrastructure side, mostly looking at infrastructure. That's something I'm very interested in, and also looking at like the sort of platform nature of it, things that can help the other engineers at the company sort of work faster, better, and then also nowadays cost is a big factor with our scale. Um, Cool. And so what is Saturn? Saturn, we describe as a social calendar, and it's kind of taking the sort of structured view that you have of, high school students' sort of daily schedule and mixing it in with just like the more dynamic, social interactions they want to have, and, how those things overlap. So the idea is our users, these high school students who just really love Saturn, will input their schedule into Saturn, and they'll be able to see once they've sort of like connected with friends on the app, they can kind of see where their schedules overlap, when they're in the same classes, when they have free periods together, etc. On top of that, Saturn also has like chat functionality, where classes can sort of ask each other questions. In the class you can ask each other questions about what happened, did I miss anything, when I fell asleep, or whatever the kids are doing these days. And then we also added community events, so that's kind of like the idea of something the whole school might be interested in, that someone can post, and then together, they can sort of know about some band practice happening or something like that after school. And so that's sort of the gist of it. And overall, like that sounds pretty simple. But I encourage you. The font's a bit small here, but I encourage you to just read the schedule and just let it sink in a little, of what we're dealing with a lot of the time in different schools. Uh, there's very little rhyme or reason to a lot of these schedules. They can change day over day. They can change on a whim. If there's a snow day, they might just put out like a brand new different one. So definitely there are like lots of interesting different ways in which schools can sort of put this data through, and then we need to do all the work to make sure that we can calculate overlaps, know where where you're supposed to be, where you're supposed to be next. And that's sort of what a lot of what the back end is dealing with. In terms of infrastructure, we are at the moment very server full. And so when I joined, this is more or less what the infrastructure looked like with some changes. And the story behind that is that Saturn was written by its first user. Our founder built this app initially just for himself and his friends to sort of do it, and later on, once he sort of learned a bit more about business, decided, hey, I want to turn this into, an actual product. And because of that, this is a system that has evolved over time. And it was a system that was built from the ground up to go, hey, we need to support all these people right now. And so helping Saturn and the engineers there sort of through this journey of like, getting to something more, that scales well and has reasonable costs is sort of what I've mostly been focusing on. Some of the challenges, we have offline data, and synchronization. So the point is that schools might not have the best internet connection, but we want users to know that if something changes, if they get anything, that the latest data is available on their phone. So a lot of time we have the app opening up, it's synchronizing anything that's changed, and it's, gets that data down to the device. And also, again, because a lot of this was decided sort of in an evolutionary way, there weren't sort of out-of-the-box solutions picked at that point. And so we have sort of a system that might not be compatible with some existing solutions that we kind of need to massage towards. And to avoid the situation where we're trying to make like a big bang migration, we're doing everything in a very incremental way. And so many items are synchronized to the whole school, and I think that's where sort of the topic of caching sort of starts, rearing its head. Of if people are asking for the same thing, you don't have to do all the work all the time. And then there are these bursts of reads. So the one example is push notifications. A lot of people know about that. Someone decides to send out a push notification on some schedule to remind people to do something, etc. And then there's a lot of activity in the app. Classes that change kind of bursts of reads. And then there's also bursts of mutation. So if you just want to ask if Saturn is like read heavy or write heavy, the answer is yes. Like sometimes it's mostly reads and sometimes it's mostly writes. And so understanding how to sort of build a system that can cope with both modes of operation is an interesting challenge. Back to school, which is where we are right now, is also an interesting time because that's when all the schedules get updated. And sometimes, state has a then school district that 2 weeks early will release a schedule, and then you're suddenly like, oh, why are we seeing all this traffic? Oh, it turns out, Georgia's going back to school soon. So it makes it very unpredictable. The other unpredictable thing is like weather, snow, hurricanes. I heard schools having hurricane days as a thing. It didn't feel like something I had to deal with before. And so that means a lot of sort of like bursty traffic happening in reads and writes. Seasonalities, and that kind of gets into that as well. We sort of have sort of the annual school term. During summer, users aren't doing much. During school year, back to school, we have lots of usage. Weeks, weekends, holidays, day, night is a seasonality. But then also correlated to school schedules. A lot of schools change class on the hour, every hour. They're not like that weird school you saw earlier. Then you're just a few minutes of just doubling your traffic and trying to, if you think about sort of like traditional ways of trying to scale like your own containers up and that, any lag you have in doing that, that's costly. Cool. And then there's rapid growth. So here I have where we were last year and the comparison. So the bottom line is 2021, the top line is 2022, and you're going to see just how much sort of difference in scale we have just from the previous year, maximizing out sort of like our previous peaks by 10x. This year, pretty much the same story, except 2022 is now the bottom line, 2023 is the top line. And so one of the lessons that really stood out when sort of like thinking of this infrastructure and seeing what the problems were that Saturn had gotten itself into with this sort of evolutionary approach is just having to think too much about things. Having something like Redis, as we learned earlier, like you potentially can like murder it using network traffic. It's something where you have to think about all those scaling variables. You have to think about your CPU. You have to think about memory pressure. You have to think about networking. And when a spike happens, you don't necessarily know which one of those you're going to hit first. Often in Redis, it's network, but another part of the system might do something else. So trying to make choices so that you have far fewer decisions to make with regard to these different axes, that helps a lot. And now being at a startup and not AWS, like thinking about pricing is a very different thing as well. Pricing axes are super important of having as few as possible of those. And then saying like, if you evaluate something that's managed or serverless by like looking at these things and understanding what you need to think about is super important to just make sure you are not putting yourselves in the same situation you are before because something promises it's better, but actually it's more or less the same shape. Momento was one of the first caching solutions that stood out to me as just getting it right. When looked at it, it was like, this is exactly what we need. We need simple. I don't want people to think about networks. I don't want people to think about like how many nodes there are, etc. And that is where we find ourselves on Momento.